A great way to stand out, to create an interesting, memorable argument and get top marks in your paper 2 essay, is to be creative in your interpretation of the question and problematize its terms. Look at the key terms and ask yourself, how can I interpret this in an unusual way? How can I focus my essay in a direction that demonstrates intelligent, independent thought and impresses the examiner? What impact does setting have on your understanding of the central ideas or themes presented in at least 2 works studied? So the impact of the setting, these are our keywords. You could turn this question on its head by arguing that the lack of setting in one of your texts, the ambiguity of the setting, is actually what communicates the central ideas of the author. Perhaps the lack of features, the lack of specificity of the setting draws your attention onto the characters and creates more of a mystery surrounding their identities. So by redefining the impact of setting as applying to a lack of setting, we are making our essay more interesting and slightly different from other students. It may also allow you to talk more easily about texts where the settings are difficult to pin down. In discussing the impact of setting, you might want to compare and contrast realistic settings versus unrealistic expressions of settings. So for example, in much of Tennessee Williams' work, he uses the heat and the humidity of his atmosphere to create a stifling atmosphere between his characters. In discussing this type of symbolism and unrealistic settings, you might want to discuss whether the setting is presented as causative of the problems in the play, or whether the setting itself is the result of a character's behaviour, actually created by the behaviours of the characters in the play. So for example, you might want to compare and contrast physical settings with emotional settings experienced in the plays. Our 4th question is, literature is often said to be timeless. To what extent is this true of at least 2 works you have studied? So the key term here is timeless, and what you're being asked to do is discuss whether the text that you've studied suggests literature is timeless or not. In problematizing this question, it might be nice to suggest that literature is not a homogeneous group, and that in fact, the timelessness of it varies from text to text. Maybe you would like to argue that one of your texts has generalized timeless themes, perhaps emotional themes that have been true for people throughout the ages, whereas another one of your texts might be very context dependent. Perhaps it's more political, perhaps it has specific features which link to the time in which it was written. So you don't need to agree with the question. Feel free to argue against it or to argue that it itself is reductive. To do that here, you would need to demonstrate the differences between texts that you have studied and the level of timelessness that you've experienced in them. That might mean for some texts demonstrating how linked to politics they were, how linked to the realities of their time they were, and therefore context-based. For some texts, that might mean demonstrating the specific circumstances in which they were written, whereas for others, you would need to demonstrate the ways in which their themes are still applicable to people today. Arguing differences puts interest into your essay. Highlighting the complexity of literature as a genre and illustrating this with the differences in your texts could be a very mature way of answering a question which treats literature as a homogeneous group. Another interesting way of answering this question could be to identify some specific elements of your text as timeless, whereas others are context dependent. For example, maybe the emotional and character-based messages of your text are arguably timeless. However, there is additional contextual information that could have helped you find greater meaning in it if you were reading it contemporarily. In this sense, you can argue that there are different levels to the meaning and reading of a text, and that somebody reading it as a contemporary of the author would have got different information than somebody reading it now. You might also wish to discuss the importance of reading literary texts with an understanding of their historical context. Question 5. It has been said that history cannot be unlived, but if faced with courage, need not be lived again. To what extent do at least 2 works studied face history in order to ensure that its wrongs need not be lived again? So we have a few key terms here. History certainly needs to be defined, but we can also discuss the nature of facing versus not facing history. So you could define the way you will use the word facing in your essay. It is fine to have multiple definitions of history in the way that you respond to this question. Your different texts may define history in different terms. For example, history in one text may be considered as historical events and precedents, whereas history in another text might actually relate to the character's history as individuals and things that they've done in the past. In discussing a text like this, you might consider how an individual character deals with their past actions, or else is doomed to repeat their past actions, perhaps demonstrating a fatal flaw. Whereas in a text influenced by actual historical events, you might be dealing with larger social issues such as slavery, immigration, and colonialism. These are the demons of the past that people must face. In defining the term facing history, you also have an opportunity to discuss characters who have not faced history. This might permit you to discuss concepts of cowardice versus courage in your texts. Which characters are capable of looking at themselves and looking at their past actions and perhaps learning to change, while other characters are doomed to repeat their mistakes. You have an opportunity here to discuss factors which might influence somebody in being brave or else cowardly in facing the past. By discussing different definitions of history, as well as the different factors which can cause people either to face or avoid the truths of history, you could have a very interesting essay on your hands. Thank you for joining me in my 5-minute presentation, Unique Approaches to Paper 2 Questions. This has been Natasha Musto, and I hope to see you soon at the Edge, where I tutor English, history, philosophy, psychology, amongst other subjects, and I specialise in Oxbridge University admissions. Thank you very much. Goodbye.